Chapter 3. Back in Denver, Matt went about his normal routine. He went to work and came home much as he had been doing for the last 2 years. Occasionally, he would go out with some guys from work, but that was about it. He didn't have much of a social life and hadn't in more than 2 years. Not since Connie's death. He certainly hadn't dated since then. Up until now, the idea had made his stomach hurt. It took him a few weeks, but he'd come to terms with JV's past. He had finally realized he was less troubled by what had happened to her. He hadn't dismissed it, it was horrible and traumatic. She'd gone through it alone, and that bothered him. She'd suffered through one of the most horrific things he could think of without any support, and that tore him up inside. Even with the stress of work and the worry about JV on his mind, the girl in the pink jacket kept popping into his head. He couldn't figure out why. He hadn't noticed anything outstanding or special about her. He hadn't even spoken to her, much less learned her name, yet he couldn't get her out of his mind. Before he knew it, May had arrived, and with it the vacation he'd scheduled to go down and see his JV. 2 whole weeks. His parents would be joining them later, but he got to spend the first week with Steve and JV without them. In some ways, it would be like they were kids again. In others, so very different. Connie wouldn't be there, and JV and Steve had never been together when they were growing up. As he packed the last of his clothes and got ready to leave for the airport, it dawned on him that he was more excited about this trip than he had been about anything in a long time. He was headed out the door when his cell rang. "Hey, what's up?" he asked, seeing it was JV. "I just wanted to double-check what time your flight lands." 3:25, but I told you, you don't have to pick me up. I can rent a car. Nope. A car for 2 weeks is gonna be way too expensive. Besides, I'm already in Phoenix. It's really no big deal. If you're sure. He loaded his suitcase into the shuttle van that had arrived to get him. I'm sure. Now shut up and get on the plane. She laughed. I'm not even to the airport yet. I'm just getting in the shuttle. Then do that. Then get on the plane. I'm waiting for a hug. He smiled. She sounded happy. Will do. See you when you get here. See you. He disconnected and pocketed the phone before climbing into the van for the ride to the airport. Getting off the plane in Phoenix wasn't much different from anywhere else. Matt had been to more than a few airports, and while the layout and decor may change from city to city, all the basics were there. Overpriced restaurants and kiosk stores for souvenirs and last-minute drinks, entertainment or toiletries, an abundance of bathrooms, security guards and long lines. He knew better than to expect JV anywhere near the gate, and took his carry-on with him down to the baggage claim area. He hadn't checked anything, but it was as good a place to meet someone as any. Right now there would be a lot of people waiting for the bags to make to the carousel, but he should be able to find JV, even if he had to resort to looking for her scent. He needn't have worried. When he got to the baggage claim area, it was impossible to miss JV. She was standing to one side with Rebecca and another girl about their age. The car in, her belly nicely rounded with her advancing pregnancy, and the stranger were standing calmly, looking around. But Matt could tell from the way JV jumped and waved that she had spotted him and was trying to get his attention. Shaking his head, he couldn't keep the grin off his face at how different she seemed. She looked happy and well-adjusted. Far better than she had in years, and again he wondered how he hadn't noticed how quiet and withdrawn she had become. He was just over halfway to her when she broke into a run and met him partway. The other girls trailed behind. He wasn't sure if they didn't want to be left alone, or just wanted to be in on the reunion. JV threw herself against him and wrapped her arms around his neck. Wrapping his arms around her waist, he hugged her, lifting her off her feet for a moment before setting her down. You look good. He wrapped one hand back around the handle on his suitcase. Thanks. She looked down at his bag. Is that all you have? Yep. Then let's get out of here. Her eyes scanned the airport, rarely resting on one thing for long. How did you manage to get the three of you here without some kind of escort? He looked around for one of the clan's enforcers, expecting someone to be nearby to keep an eye on the Karen. Are you saying we're so much trouble, we need a chaperone? Rebecca asked. No. He glanced at the clan leader, who was closer to his sister's age than his. He'd never asked, but he was pretty sure she was a little younger than JV. But Steve told me a little about the trouble you had with your first clan. A shadow passed over Rebecca's eyes and she glanced around, nervous. I don't mean to upset you, I just expected you to have someone around to protect you. Rebecca grinned and gave him a cunning look. But I do. Who? He looked around again, trying to find who he'd missed. He flinched when JV kicked him in the shin. Me, dummy? Matt frowned and turned to look at his sister. You're an enforcer now? She grinned, obviously pleased at having kept it from him. I am. And Steve's okay with this? He is. Well, as entertaining as this is. I'm ready to get out of here. I'm done with the crowds. The girl Matt didn't know put in. Matt turned and gave the girl his full attention for the first time. He hadn't been wrong, she looked a little younger than JV, maybe a couple years. She had chocolate brown eyes and long dark hair that hung in a smooth waterfall down her back. He wasn't sure how long it was, but long enough it didn't fall over her shoulders when she turned her head. I'm sorry, I don't know you. I'm Matt. I'm sure you already know why I've come. He offered one hand. She looked at it for a long moment before taking it. I'm Alex. When her skin touched his, Matt felt a jolt of something he couldn't explain. Something he'd never felt before. Doing his best not to let anything show, he shook her hand, then released it. It's nice to meet you. The odd zap that raced up her arm when he shook her hand startled Alex. She had no idea what it was, but it didn't hurt. It was oddly pleasant. She looked him up and down a moment. It's nice to meet you too. There was something familiar about him, but she wasn't sure. Then it hit her. You were visiting over Christmas, weren't you? A crease appeared between his eyes. Yeah, did we meet then? Somehow I can't believe I would forget you. Not exactly. I think it was you sitting on the porch, scowling at your feet when I arrived to see the clan leaders. She glanced around, making sure there was no one paying attention to what they were saying. He looked at her for several seconds. The hot pink coat. She grinned. That's me. He smiled back. What are we hanging around here for? We still have 4 hours to go? At least, Alex said. That's if traffic's good. JV led the way back to the car, Rebecca right behind her, then Alex. Alex noticed that Matt stayed behind everyone else, and kept looking around as if looking for something. She fell back to walk beside him. What are you waiting for? Nothing in particular, just watching. She walked with him the rest of the way, keeping an eye on him and the two women in front of them. JV may be an enforcer and the Shaku's mate, but she was new to the pack, and Alex was worried about her friend now that JV's brother let slip that she, Rebecca, had had some trouble with her previous clan. She didn't know much about it, but both women were her friends, and she figured an extra pair of eyes couldn't hurt. Matt knew that if there were any reason to worry, then Steve wouldn't have let the three of them come to town without more guards. That was, if he'd allowed them to come at all. Not that his friend was particularly bossy or controlling of JV, but he was the Shaku. It was his responsibility to make sure that the pack leaders were safe and protected. It wouldn't matter if he was angering his mate, he'd do what he had to do. In the garage, JV unlocked a large SUV and opened the back gate so Matt could load his bag, revealing several overnight bags and an abundance of shopping bags. "Good night, nurse. What did you girls do? Buy out the town?" He lifted his small suitcase into rear and hung his suit bag from the hook on one side. Alex frowned at him, but Rebecca laughed. "Of course not." "How long have you been in town?" he asked, heading for the rear door on the passenger's side. "Here, take the front seat," Rebecca said. "Then you can talk easier." "There's no need. I'm fine in the back." "If you insist." She climbed up in the seat, using the handle near the windshield to pull herself into the truck. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" He watched to make sure she didn't fall and hurt herself. "I'm all right. Just a little awkward. I'm all belly now, and sometimes forget that I can't just climb up like I used to." "You look really good." His eyes dropped to her belly. He couldn't stop the pain that shot through his heart. Connie had only been a little bigger than Rebecca was now, when he'd lost her and the baby. "Thanks, but I'm only gonna get bigger, I know." She closed the door, and he got in the seat behind her. "How long have you been in town?" Matt asked again, once they were all buckled in and JV started the truck. "We came in yesterday." JV twisted in her seat, checking for cars as she started to back out of the parking space. "And shop till you dropped?" He couldn't help but tease. JV shook her head and rolled her eyes. "Actually, we've been getting the last of the things for the wedding," Alex said. Matt looked over at where she sat on the other end of the bench seat where he sat. She wore a deep purple tank top and jeans. The top made her deep chocolate eyes seem to glow, and he tried not to think about the strange pull somewhere deep in his gut. "Where's our next stop?" Matt turned his attention back to the women in the front seat. "That depends on you." JV glanced at him in the mirror. "What do you mean? Are you hungry? Want to stop and get something to eat before we head out of town, or do you just want to get home?" "Well, it's your home, not mine, but I'm good. I don't need to stop, but if you girls want something, don't let me stop you." He glanced at each one of them in turn, waiting for an answer. JV turned and looked at Rebecca. "You're the one who eats most often. What do you want to do?" Rebecca was silent a moment. "I'm good for now, but that doesn't mean I won't want to something later." JV laughed. "I don't doubt it." Her laugh made something in him jump. He was glad she was laughing more easily. She had been so different for a while, and though he knew why now, he was glad to see some of the JV he'd grown up with. She looked back at him in the mirror. "So heading home it is for now." "That's fine." He watched out the window at the city speeding past. It was a long drive, and he didn't need to spend the whole ride thinking about the girl sitting beside him. And that's what she was, a girl. Barely old enough to be called a woman, in his mind. He should see her as a kid, instead he kept seeing something else. Something that made his chest ache with guilt. It was a drive he'd made several times before, and while he knew it took several hours, this time it seemed to take days. He knew something wasn't right when it seemed like an hour and a half to get to the edge of town, rather than the usual half an hour or so. But the drive to Payson seemed to never end, and he knew that was only the first leg. Glancing at his watch, he discovered that time was moving normally. It just seemed to drag on. He listened to the women laugh and talk about the upcoming wedding, without adding more than a word or two here and there. They knew what they were doing, and far more than he did about weddings. They didn't need his input. His mind started to wander, and he was thinking about seeing Steve and the rest of the guys on the ranch when a shock ran through his arm, as if he'd been touched with something that caused an electrical charge to race through him. He jumped and shook his head, looking around to see what was up. Alex was pulling her arm back, as if she'd reached across the seat and shook him for some reason. "You all right?" JV asked from behind the wheel. "Yeah, why?" he asked. "Because I've been talking to you for 5 minutes, but obviously you haven't heard a word of it." "Sorry. I was thinking about something else." "I bet. You were a million miles away." He shrugged. "I was just thinking." "What was it you were saying?" He shifted and stretched in his seat, rubbing one hand up his arm, trying to rub away the sensation of being shocked without making it obvious. "I said a lot of things, but mainly I was asking if you've talked to Mom and Dad recently?" "A couple days ago, why?" "I'm not sure." She frowned at him in the rear-view mirror. "Something just seems off. They haven't said anything, and last I talked to them they'll be here on the 23rd, but something feels off." "I don't know anything about it. Things were fine when I talked to them." JV shook her head, apparently not satisfied with his answer. "Maybe it's your own anxiety?" Alex offered. "Your wedding is only 2 weeks away now, and you've had so much happen in the last few months." "I don't think so. The wedding is legal and a celebration. We're already mated, the wedding won't change that or how we feel about each other. I've got no reason to worry about it." "But she has a point," Rebecca put in. "You've had a lot happen over the last few months. I take it from Matt's reaction he didn't know you'd made the enforcer team?" "No, I wanted to surprise him." "Did you tell your folks?" JV was quiet a moment. "No." Rebecca leaned over and laid one hand on JV's leg. "In 6 months' time you've found a new clan, mated, grown your ability to heal exponentially, become an enforcer, and now you're getting married. Your family knows some of it, but they're also still reeling from what they learned a few months ago. If you haven't shared with them how well you're doing with us, it's very possible they're worried about you. More than normal, that is." JV took a deep breath and let it out in a rush. "You're right. I guess I'm just used to keeping my life to myself. I didn't think to share. I should call when we get home." Matt looked at his watch and quickly did the math as to when they would get back to the ranch. "Maybe you should put that call off until tomorrow. By the time we get home, it will be after 8. That's after 10 their time. They'll likely be in bed. Even if they're not, you know a call that late will send them into a panic about what's wrong, and who could be dying for someone to call that late?" JV glanced at him before looking back at the road. "You're right. I'll call tomorrow. I just hope I can find a way to keep it from sounding like I've been hiding it from them. I don't want to hurt their feelings again." In Payson, JV asked if anyone was hungry. No one was, but by the time they reached Show Low, a little over an hour and a half later, she was starving. "What does everyone want to eat?" JV asked as she slowed the truck to the lower speed limit of the town. "I'm easy," Alex said. "I don't care." Matt glanced around the car. He could eat, but he wasn't starving. There was no reason not to indulge whatever craving the Karen might have. He might not feel the same way if she weren't pregnant. But she was. Either way, he didn't really care. "Meat," Rebecca said with certainty. JV laughed. "Meat it is. Do you have some place you prefer?" "No, I'm not very familiar with this place." "Me either, but I do know of a killer barbecue place. Steve brought me last month." Matt was glad to hear that his friend took her out and had fun with her. He still had the tendency to want to shelter and protect her from any more harm, but he didn't get to see her that often, and the revelation they'd made at Christmas was still fresh in his mind. Steve lived with her every day, and got to see how far she'd come from when she'd shown up on his doorstep shying away from people's touch because it burned. He could still see glimpses of the girl she'd been for years, but more often he saw the happy child she'd been. Though she was truly neither of those now. She had grown into her own person. He could see it, and it made him glad she'd found happiness. Barbecue is fine with me. He watched the cute little town pass by, wondering what other changes his sister had made in her life that she hadn't told the family about. It was after dark by the time JV parked the truck in the yard in front of the cabin. Rebecca and Nick called home. They dropped Alex off first. When Alex had said her goodbyes and gotten out of the truck, Matt had felt an odd pulling sensation, but after JV pulled out and they were back on the road, it faded. Matt didn't think about it after that. He was too busy answering questions from JV and Rebecca. "How are things in Denver?" his sister asked. "Good. Weather's starting to be pretty nice, so I'm staying busy when I'm not working." "That's good," JV said. "Who takes care of the business when you're not around?" Rebecca asked. "I've got a good staff. My secretary does wonders with forwarding me what needs my attention, and my partner is taking care of things while I'm gone. I deliberately scheduled nothing for the next couple weeks, so I don't have to do much while I'm here." "Must be nice to have everything taken care of for you." JV's tone was light, teasing. "I didn't say it's all taken care of for me, but I am thankful that things work as smoothly as they do." The drive from Alex's place wasn't a long one, since her family's ranch shared a border with the Khans, and before too long they'd arrived. Matt pulled his bags from the back of the truck and grabbed several of the shopping bags as well. JV and Rebecca came around to the rear of the truck to get things too. He let JV get a load, but every time Rebecca reached for something, he took it first. After about the third time, she stopped and looked at him. Her hands on her hips only made her rounded belly more obvious. "Are you going to let me get anything, or not?" "Nope." He grinned at the tiny woman in front of him. She was several inches taller than JV, but she was slender, and for the next little while at least, all belly. "You don't need to be haulin' anything more than you're already carryin'." "I'm not an invalid." She folded her arms across her chest and snorted. "I know you're not. But I'm still not going to let you carry any of this stuff in. And I'll bet money that your mate wouldn't either." She snorted, turned on her heel and went inside muttering under her breath about overbearing, overprotective men. "You nailed that one," JV said from beside him. "What do you mean?" He turned and looked at her. "Nick won't let her lift or carry anything. It drives her crazy." Matt chuckled, shook his head and headed inside. He stopped outside the door and was preparing to knock when it swept open in front of him. The Khan stepped aside, letting Matt in. "Good to see you." Nick clapped him on the shoulder with one hand. "How was your trip?" "Long." Matt looked around for somewhere to put the girls' shopping bags. "Just put the bags on the couch. The girls can go through them later. Put your bag next to the back door. You can take it out when you go out later." Matt nodded and put the bags where he was told before heading out for another load from the truck. He met Nick at the front door again. "This is the last of it." Nick kicked the front door closed. JV took her suitcase around to their place. "I'm sure she'll be in soon." "Where's Steve?" He looked around for the man who, as far as he had seen, stayed pretty close to the clan leader. "Down at the barn. He's making one last check on things for the evening. He'll be back soon." Matt nodded and shoved his hands in his pockets, not sure what to do. "You hungry?" Nick asked. Not really. We ate about an hour and a half ago. How about a drink then? I'll take one of those. Beer, whiskey, or something lighter? Beer sounds good to me. They went into the kitchen, and Nick handed him a beer. What did you say to Rebecca? She came tearing in, glared at me, then disappeared into the bedroom. I wouldn't let her carry anything in. He shrugged. Nick chuckled. That's about what I figured it was. Doesn't take much to set her off these days. I was hoping a couple days in the city and some shopping would put her in better spirits. She sounded good until we got home. All the girls were happy, chatting and giggling. That's good to hear. Nick looked in the direction of the bedroom where Rebecca had gone. I sometimes worry about her. She's only made a few close friends, and I worry if she's happy out here with me. She might be in a fit of temper at the moment, but I have no doubts she's happy, and would be anywhere as long as she's with you. She loves you and she glows with it whenever you're around. Nick looked at him a moment, as if trying to tell if he was lying. I'm glad to hear you say so. It's a load off my mind. I wouldn't worry too much about it, if I were you. The temper kind of comes with pregnancy. Between the hormones being all over the place and feeling uncomfortable and unattractive, it's normal. Nick tilted his head. You been around many pregnant shifters? Just one. Matt tipped one corner of his mouth up in a bittersweet smile. And I didn't get to see it through, but Connie was much the same. Connie? My wife. Matt knew that using the word wife would let Nick know that Connie hadn't been his mate. It wasn't that he hadn't wanted to mate her, but the draw of the mating bond wasn't there for them. It didn't mean they hadn't loved each other though. I didn't realize you're married. Surprise was clear on Nick's face. I'm not. Matt looked out the window over the sink, towards the stretch of trees that separated the main house from the smaller cabin where Matt's best friend and sister lived. Connie was killed about 2.5 years ago. A drunk driver crossed the yellow line and hit her car head-on. She never had a chance. He fell silent for a moment. Neither did our son. He never got to draw a breath before he was taken away. His voice had gone soft and distant. I'm sorry. I can't imagine losing Rebecca, even before she got pregnant. Now I think it would kill me. It's not easy, I can tell you that much. It still hurts and I'm not sure it will ever stop. I'm not sure something like that ever does. I think you just learn to live with the pain and move on. Matt looked at his sister's clan leader. I think you're right. The back door opened and Steve stepped inside. He stomped the dust from his boots and continued into the kitchen. Hey, glad to see you made it. He gave Matt a one-armed hug and stepped back. How was the trip? Long like always. I don't get why you have to live hours from the nearest airport. We're not that far from an airport. There's one less than 20 miles from here. It's just the nearest one that has the big airlines. That's a bit of a drive. Besides, I like it up here. You know how I feel about living crammed in next to thousands of people. Steve wrinkled his nose. I was surprised to be picked up by the girls though. Matt watched his friend's reaction. Yeah, well, they wanted to do some shopping and we couldn't come up with a reasonable excuse not to let them. And without a guard? Steve lifted one corner of his mouth. Yeah, it wasn't my first choice, but Jade would have had my ass if I sent one of the men along. She's a qualified enforcer, and she would have seen it as my not having faith in her ability to take care of them. Jade was the nickname Steve had given JV when she was about 7 or 8. He was the only one who ever used it, but he almost never called her anything else. About that, I can't believe you let her test for enforcer. Matt shook his head. I didn't really want to. It started out as her sparring with us, getting a decent workout and building her self-confidence and her ability to defend herself. She needed that. I can see that, but an enforcer? It kind of got away from me. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She was sparring with the guys one day, knocked Bobby on his ass for about the third time that morning, and he suggested she try out. She laughed it off and so did I. But a few days later, she asked me if I thought she could do it. I had no doubt she could, she's that good. And as much as wanted to, I couldn't tell her no, it would have destroyed the confidence she'd worked so hard to build. Matt blinked. But what about her business? And a family, isn't that putting her at unnecessary risk? She doesn't do much in the way of enforcer duties. Come on you two, let's have a seat while you talk. Nick filled his coffee mug at the pot on the counter, then moved to the round breakfast table next to the window. The other two men joined him. Being qualified as an enforcer has mostly given her and Rebecca a little more freedom. With Rebecca's pregnancy progressing, Nick would prefer to keep one of us nearby just in case something happens. We don't have any known adversaries and we haven't heard from her clan in more than 18 months, but he'd rather be safe than sorry. Now the two, well, three of them now, as Alex is with them nearly all the time, anyway, they can go into town and go shopping or see a movie if they want, without having to see if someone can go with them. They get more girl time without having to drag one of the men along. Okay, I can see that. Matt nodded slowly. But Phoenix? From the luggage, they were there at least overnight. Yeah, this was their first overnight trip. I haven't talked to Jade yet, but if anything had gone wrong, she would have contacted me right away. They had fun, and with the stress of planning the wedding, they needed it. The back door opened again, and JV came in. She toed off her sandals and came into the kitchen. What are you guys up to? She asked, looking around the table. Just catching up. Where's Rebecca? She's in the bedroom. She's in a bit of a snit, because Matt wouldn't let her carry anything. Nick said. All right, I'll go check on her. She leaned over and dropped a kiss on Steve's lips. Missed you, babe. I missed you too. He wrapped an arm around her hips and pulled her close. He buried his face in her stomach and just held her for a moment, then released her. Go check on Rebecca, I'll be here when you get done. She went through the kitchen and disappeared down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Can't you keep your hands off her for 5 minutes? Matt grumped. He knew he was being unreasonable, but really Steve knew she is his sister. Steve shrugged. I could if I wanted to, but I don't want to. Besides, she's been gone for 2 days. If I didn't do something, she'd think I was mad. Matt scowled at his friend, but it was only half serious. He could see the two of them were happier than either had been in years. That made it worth having to watch the two of them together. Though he still thought Steve was too old for JV. Not that his opinion was worth the cost of ink, if he were to write it down. JV came back after only a couple of minutes. She's curled up on top of the bed sound asleep. We stayed busy all weekend. I have no doubt she's exhausted, but she wouldn't let us take a break for her. Nick started to stand, and JV continued. I covered her with an Afghan, give her a little while. Nick shook his head. Let me go check on her. He stood and disappeared down the hall. JV pulled a beer from the fridge, twisted the top off and tipped it back in a long drink. So, you two threw growling at each other over me? I don't growl over you, Steve said. At you sometimes, but that's about it. He grinned and slid his chair back from the table several inches. JV sat on his lap and bent down to kiss him again. No, Matt growls and you ignore him. She smiled down at him, and Matt could see the affection between them. As much as he'd disliked the idea of the two of them together, he couldn't argue with what was in front of him. Nick came back after a few moments. She woke up. Said she hadn't meant to fall asleep, and she'll be out in a few minutes. It was after 10 by the time Matt, along with Steve and JV, made their way down the narrow path that led through the strip of woods separating the Shaku's house from that of the Khan and Karen. The short walk took less than 5 minutes, even in the dark moonless night. Soon they were in the small cabin where his sister lived with his best friend. Matt took his suitcase to the bedroom where he always stayed. Not that he'd been visiting all that long. Until a few months ago, he'd never seen where Steve lived. Whenever they saw each other, which really hadn't been often, Steve had visited Matt in Denver. The first time Matt had come to Springerville, he'd knocked and punched Steve in the jaw when he'd opened the door. He'd heard JV was here, and had come to check on her. When Steve had opened the door, his nose had told him that his friend had been sleeping with his sister. Her scent was all over him, and not just a little like it would have been after a hug or spending time with her. He had been covered in it. Matt hadn't thought about it, he'd just hit him. He didn't regret it. Steve knew better than to mess with JV, and while Matt had later found out that there had been nothing really going on between the two of them, Matt still felt like he'd needed to defend her honor. He still didn't like the age difference. JV was about a dozen years younger than Matt and Steve, but he could see she was far happier now that she'd been for a very long time. That did more to convince him than anything either of them said. He dropped his suitcase in the spare bedroom and headed back to the main room, stopping by the bathroom and washing his face on the way. Between two airports, the flight and the 3-hour car ride, it had been a long day, and he needed to wash some of the travel dirt from his face. In the living room, he looked around. Not much had changed since the last time he'd been there. There were a few softer touches around the room. A couple pictures of Steve and JV together, one where you couldn't see Steve's face, just his back and his arms stretched around her while JV laughed. Matt sat in the recliner near the sofa, where the two were sitting together. Steve sat on the couch normally, but JV was laying, her legs kicked over the opposite arm while her head lay on Steve's leg. Steve's fingers idly combed through her hair where it lay spread across his lap. They had both glanced at him as he walked through, then turned their attention back to the TV screen on the wall. The news was on, and they were listening to the latest happenings. After a couple minutes, the TV went to commercial, and they both looked over at him. "You comfortable in there?" JV asked. "Anything you need? Towels? Soap?" "No, I'm good and I know where the towels are." "Good." She closed her eyes and seemed to revel in the feel of her mate's hand gently tugging through her hair. "Thanks for coming down early to help out." Steve met his gaze. "While it's not a huge event by Denver standards, it's a pretty big one for around here. The clan will help out, but I'm more comfortable with family around, both chosen in blood." Matt knew that JV and Steve considered Nick and Rebecca family. Steve had been here with Nick for nearly 10 years, and had been here when Rebecca had entered the equation. They were closer than his real parents, who Steve distanced himself from for 10 years, not because of some issue between them but because he couldn't stand to return and watch JV, knowing he couldn't have her. He'd separated himself from home to protect Matt's little sister. His parents now understood that, and were on their way to rebuilding the relationship, but it was a slow process. The news came on and went to sports. Steve muted the TV. While there were people in the clan who cared about sports, he wasn't one of them. He had too much to worry about in his life to care about people doing pretend battle for the entertainment of others. Matt knew how he felt because he'd said so often enough. "What do we still have to do to pull this thing off?" Matt looked at his sister and Steve. "Thing? You mean my wedding?" JV lifted one brow at him. "Yeah, that." She rolled her eyes and let her head fall back against Steve. "You deal with him." She looked up at her mate. A half smile formed on Steve's face as he looked down at her, then his eyes flicked to Matt. Most of it's taken care of. We've just got the bridal shower to worry about. He continued to run his fingers through her loose hair. Don't forget your bachelor party, she said with her eyes closed, then looked over at Matt. That's your responsibility. Matt blinked. Bachelor party? Yeah, you know, that one last chance to do something really stupid before he's tied to me forever. JV had closed her eyes again and looked completely at ease lying there. 'Cause a legal ceremony is gonna tie him tighter than a mating? He lifted one brow at his friend and waited to see what she came up with next. That mating is why I have no problem with whatever you put together. I know he's mine and that won't change. She rubbed her face against Steve's stomach like a cat, a soft smile forming on her lips. He watched her a moment longer. Have you decided when I should do this party? He figured she probably had it all laid out, and all he had to do was show up. Knowing his sister the way he did, it wasn't an impossibility. Well, Friday night would be best, but that's up to you. Why Friday? Because that will get you guys out of our hair. You're gonna have to have some kind of security, you know that. Steve stopped combing his fingers through her hair and let his hand rest on the hair still spread across his other leg. I'm an enforcer, I can act as our security. She opened her eyes and frowned at Steve. You are, but it's your bridal shower. You're not working. You'll have guards. She opened her mouth to argue, but he continued, stopping her. They'll stay outside and not interfere with your fun, but you'll have at least 2 men. One on the front porch and one on the back. Matt frowned. Is there some reason to have 2? Something going on? Nothing major and nothing new, but there's always something with clan politics. When you consider that we'll have several women, including our Karin, in the house for the party, especially considering Rebecca's condition, I'd rather be safe than sorry. I want you guys well guarded. He looked down at JV with that last. She sighed and frowned at him but didn't argue. What about you guys? You're taking Nick, aren't you? Who's gonna guard you? I don't think we really need a guard. Steve rolled his eyes. Matt knew that wasn't going to make JV happy. Nope. If we get a guard, you get one. All right, I'll make sure we've got someone with us. What do you want me to do? Matt looked at Steve. Nothing really. I don't need a bachelor party. Yes, you do. JV said from his lap. Okay, so I do. Steve rolled his eyes again. Just get some of the guys together. We'll go out for a drink or something. I can do that.